The strangest thing about that rainy night was this. The woman who gave away her last $10 believed she was helping a desperate stranger. She had no idea she had just changed the life of a man who owned more money than most cities could imagine. And she definitely did not expect that only a few days later that same man would return as a millionaire determined to change her life forever. The night air hung cold and heavy over the train station, the kind of damp chill that slipped through thin coats and settled deep into the bones. Neon lights from a diner across the street flickered against puddles on the cracked pavement. People hurried past with their collars pulled high, each one wrapped in their own worries. Near the far end of the platform stood a young woman named Emily Carter, clutching the strap of her worn canvas bag as the wind tugged at her hair. She had just finished a long shift cleaning tables at a small family restaurant 3 blocks away. Her feet ached, her stomach was empty, and inside the pocket of her coat was the last $10 she had in the world. That $10 was supposed to buy her dinner and breakfast the next morning. But life rarely followed careful plans. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Now the wind picked up again, rattling the metal sign above the platform as Emily glanced toward the arrival board. The next train would not come for another 30 minutes. She sighed softly and rubbed her hands together, trying to keep warm. That was when she heard a quiet voice behind her. "Excuse me." The words were hesitant, almost embarrassed. Emily turned slowly and saw a man standing a few steps away. His coat looked thin and damp from the rain. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his eyes carried the tired weight of someone who had not slept well in a long time. He looked like a man who had been pushed too far by life. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said gently, his voice unsteady from the cold. "My wallet was stolen tonight. I just need $10 for a train ticket home. I promise I will pay it back." For a moment, the platform fell silent, except for the distant rumble of traffic. Emily felt her fingers tighten inside her pocket around the single bill. $10. The last thing standing between her and a very hungry night. She could walk away. She probably should walk away. After all, strangers lied every day in a city like this. But something about the way the man spoke made it difficult to ignore him. There was no anger in his voice, no pressure, only quiet exhaustion. His hands trembled slightly as the wind cut through the station. Emily studied his face carefully. There was dignity there, even in the middle of desperation. And for reasons she could not explain, that mattered. She took a slow breath and reached in her pocket. The paper bill crinkled softly between her fingers as she pulled it out and held it for a moment, staring at it as if weighing the cost of kindness. Finally, she stepped forward and placed the money into the stranger hand. "I do not know your story," she said quietly, "but I believe you should get home safely tonight." The man stared at the bill in disbelief, then looked up at her with an expression that seemed almost stunned. "Thank you," he whispered. "You have no idea what this means." Emily gave a small, tired smile and shrugged. "It is only $10. But sometimes the smallest acts change everything. And neither of them knew yet that this simple moment on a cold American train platform was about to rewrite both of their futures. The train pulled away with a long metallic groan, its headlights fading into the wet darkness beyond the station platform. Emily stood still for a moment, watching the empty tracks as the wind brushed against her coat. The space beside her where the stranger had been standing only seconds earlier already felt strangely quiet, as if the moment had vanished the instant it ended. She slipped her hands into her pockets and felt nothing there now. The last $10 she owned was gone. Her stomach tightened slightly as the reality settled in. That money had been meant for food, maybe a cup of coffee in the morning before her next shift. Now there would be none of that. For a brief second doubt crept into her mind. Maybe the man had lied. Maybe he had taken the money and would disappear like every other stranger in a city too large to remember one small act of kindness. But the thought did not stay long. Emily had spent enough years struggling to understand that kindness was rarely a safe investment. It was simply a choice. She wrapped her arms around herself and began walking toward the bus stop across the street. The rain had slowed to a mist that hung in the air like a thin gray curtain. Street lights reflected across the wet pavement, and the smell of fried onions drifted from the diner on the corner. Normally, she might have gone inside to warm up, but tonight she knew better than to tempt herself with food she could not afford. The bus ride home took almost 40 minutes, winding through quiet neighborhoods and long stretches of dark highway. Emily sat near the back, staring out the fogged window as the city passed by in soft blurs of yellow light. Her apartment building waited at the edge of an older part of town where paint peeled from the walls and the elevator rarely worked. When the bus finally stopped 2 blocks away, she stepped out into the cold night air again and walked slowly toward the narrow brick building that held her small studio apartment. Inside the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above worn carpet. She climbed 3 flights of stairs because the elevator had once again broken down. By the time she reached her door, her legs felt heavy and her stomach was empty enough to ache. She unlocked the door and stepped into the tiny room that held everything she owned. A narrow bed stood against one wall, a small table near the window, and a second-hand refrigerator that hummed quietly in the corner. Emily set her bag down and opened the refrigerator out of habit, even though she already knew what she would find. A half bottle of water and nothing else. She closed the door again and leaned back against it with a tired breath. Tonight would be another night of going to sleep hungry. Still, she did not regret what she had done. Somewhere on the other side of the city, a stranger was riding a train home instead of standing alone in the cold. That thought was enough for her. She changed into an old sweater and sat at the small table beside the window. Outside, the rain continued to fall in thin silver lines beneath the streetlight. For a long time, she simply watched the empty street and listened to the quiet hum of the building around her. Eventually, exhaustion pulled her towards sleep. She lay down on the bed and pulled the thin blanket over her shoulders, hoping morning would arrive quickly. Across the city at that very moment, the man who had taken the $10 sat alone inside the quiet luxury of a black town car moving through the glowing skyline. The train ticket he had purchased remained folded in his pocket, untouched. His name was Daniel Whitaker, and the truth about him was something Emily Carter could not possibly imagine. Daniel was not a desperate traveler. He was the founder and chief executive officer of Whitaker Global Holdings, a corporation whose offices stretched across multiple states and whose annual revenue reached into billions of dollars. Yet tonight, he was not thinking about board meetings or business deals. Instead, he was thinking about the young woman standing on that lonely platform who had given away the last money she had without hesitation. He stared out the window of the car as the city lights slid past in golden streaks. In a world where most people measured kindness against personal gain, what Emily Carter had done felt almost unbelievable. Daniel slowly unfolded the $10 bill and studied it beneath the soft interior light of the car. The edges were worn from use. It looked ordinary, insignificant even, but to him it now carried a meaning far greater than its value. For the first time in years, Daniel Whitaker felt something stir inside him that business success had never managed to create. Respect and curiosity. He slipped the bill carefully into his wallet and spoke quietly to the driver in the front seat. Find out who she is. I want to know everything about the woman who gave away her last $10. Morning arrived slowly over the aging neighborhood where Emily Carter lived, the pale light of dawn slipping through the narrow gap between the curtains of her small apartment. The sound of distant traffic drifted through the cracked window as the city began to wake. But inside the room, everything remained quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Emily opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of another long day ahead. Her stomach reminded her almost immediately that she had gone to bed without dinner. The dull ache was not new. It had become a quiet companion during the past several months as she struggled to keep up with rent, bus fares, and the endless small expenses that came with living alone in a large American city. She sat up slowly and pushed her hair back from her face, taking a deep breath before standing. Outside her window, the street below was already alive with early commuters carrying coffee cups and rushing toward bus stops. Emily pulled on her work uniform, a simple black shirt and faded jeans that still smelled faintly of the diner kitchen. The small restaurant where she worked opened early each morning to serve construction workers, delivery drivers, and night shift nurses finishing long hours at the nearby hospital. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest, and Emily had always believed that honest work mattered. She grabbed her canvas bag and stepped out into the hallway, locking the door behind her before making the long walk down 3 flights of stairs. The cold morning air greeted her as she stepped outside. A thin layer of clouds hung low over the city, turning the sunlight pale and gray. Emily pulled her jacket tighter and began the 15-minute walk toward the diner where she worked 6 days a week. As she walked, she passed small storefronts just beginning to open, the smell of fresh bread drifting from a bakery on the corner. For a moment, she paused outside the window, watching customers inside sip coffee and laugh together. Her stomach tightened again, but she forced herself to keep walking. Inside the diner, the warm scent of bacon and coffee filled the air as soon as she pushed through the door. The bell above the entrance rang softly. Her manager, a middle-aged man named Carl, glanced up from the register. "You're a few minutes early today," he said with a tired smile. Emily nodded politely and tied her apron around her waist. "I cannot sleep much," she replied gently. Carl shrugged and handed her a stack of menus. "Breakfast rush will start soon. Tables by the window are yours." Within half an hour, the diner filled with the usual crowd of early customers. Emily moved quickly between tables with practiced ease, refilling coffee cups and carrying plates of eggs and toast. She greeted everyone with the same warm patience she had learned to show even on the hardest days. Most people never noticed how tired she looked or how thin her wallet had become. To them, she was simply another waitress in another busy diner somewhere in America. Across the city in a quiet glass office high above downtown streets, Daniel Whitaker was beginning his own morning in a very different world. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the executive conference room as he stood near the table reviewing documents from his assistant. Several members of his executive team sat nearby discussing quarterly profits, but Daniel's attention was somewhere else entirely. The image of the young woman on the train platform had not left his thoughts. Her voice had been calm, her eyes sincere, and she had given away the last $10 she owned without asking for anything in return. In his world, generosity was often a calculated move, something attached to contracts and expectations. What Emily Carter had done felt completely different. His assistant, a sharp and efficient woman named Laura Mitchell, entered the room carrying a small folder. "You asked me to look into the woman from the station last night," she said quietly. Daniel turned toward her immediately. "Did you find her?" Laura placed the folder on the table and opened it. "Her name is Emily Carter. She works at a diner on Franklin Street. Lives alone in a small apartment nearby. No criminal record. No wealthy family connections. Just a woman working very hard to stay afloat." Daniel looked down at the photograph clipped inside the folder. It showed Emily leaving the diner earlier that morning, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders as she walked through the cold. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then a small, thoughtful smile appeared on his face. "Clear the afternoon schedule," he told Laura calmly. "I would like to visit that diner on Franklin Street." The afternoon sun hung low over Franklin Street, casting long shadows across the sidewalk as the lunch rush slowly began to build inside the small diner where Emily Carter worked. The steady clatter of plates and the soft murmur of conversations filled the air while the smell of grilled sandwiches and fresh coffee drifted through the room. Emily moved quickly between tables, balancing 2 plates in one hand while pouring coffee with the other. It was the busiest part of the day when construction crews, office workers, and delivery drivers crowded into the diner looking for a quick meal before returning to work. Emily greeted each person with the same warm patience she always showed, even though the dull ache of hunger still lingered from the night before. She had not eaten since the afternoon of the previous day, but she had learned how to ignore that feeling and keep moving. The bell above the front door suddenly rang again as another customer stepped inside. Emily glanced up briefly while wiping down a nearby table, and for a moment her hands froze. The man standing just inside the doorway looked strangely familiar. His dark hair was neatly combed now, and he wore a simple but clean coat, yet there was something unmistakable about his face. It was the stranger from the train platform. Emily blinked once, surprised, wondering if she was mistaken. The man hesitated near the entrance as his eyes moved slowly across the room, clearly searching for someone. When his gaze finally met hers, a faint smile appeared on his face. For a second, Emily felt a flicker of recognition pass between them, like a quiet spark. Then he walked toward an empty table near the window and sat down. Emily forced herself to take a slow breath before picking up a menu and approaching him. Her heart beat slightly faster as she stepped closer. "Good afternoon," she said politely in the same professional tone she used with every customer. "Welcome to Franklin Street Diner. What can I get started for you today?" The man looked up at her, and his expression softened immediately. "Hello, Emily," he said gently. "It is good to see you again." The sound of her name caught her off guard. Emily frowned slightly in confusion. "I am sorry, have we met before?" The man nodded once. "Last night, at the train station. You helped me when I needed it." The memory returned instantly. Emily felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "Oh," she said quietly, suddenly remembering the $10 she had given him. "I'm glad you made it home safely." The man leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands on the table. "I did, thanks to you." There was a calm sincerity in his voice that made Emily feel unexpectedly relieved. For a moment, neither of them spoke while the sounds of the busy diner continued around them. Finally, Emily set the menu in front of him. "Well, I'm happy to hear that. What would you like to order?" The man glanced down at the menu for only a moment before looking back at her. "I will have the house breakfast," he said, "and coffee, please." Emily nodded and wrote the order down quickly. "I will bring that right out." As she turned to walk back toward the kitchen, she heard his voice again behind her. "Emily." She paused and looked over her shoulder. "Yes." He reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed a folded bill, holding it between his fingers. "I believe this belongs to you." He placed the money gently on the edge of the table. Emily walked back slowly and glanced down. It was the same worn $10 bill she had given him the night before. She shook her head immediately. "No," she said softly. "That was not a loan. You needed it more than I did." The man studied her quietly for a moment, clearly surprised by her answer. Most people would have taken the money back without hesitation. But Emily simply pushed the bill back toward him. "I meant what I said last night," she added. "Sometimes people just need help getting home." The man looked down at the bill again and then back at her, something thoughtful appearing in his expression. "You are a rare person, Emily Carter," he said quietly. Emily blinked in surprise. "How do you know my last name?" The man smiled slightly, but did not answer right away. Instead, he folded the $10 bill once more and slipped it back into his wallet. "Because sometimes kindness deserves to be remembered," he replied calmly. Then he leaned forward slightly across the table, his voice lowering just enough that only she could hear his next words. "And sometimes the person who gives kindness away is about to receive something far greater in return." Emily stood beside the table for a moment after the man spoke those quiet words, unsure how to respond. Around them, the diner continued moving at its usual pace, plates clattering in the kitchen and customers laughing over coffee. Yet the small space between them felt strangely still. She finally gave a polite smile, the kind she used whenever a conversation with a customer became confusing. "I'm not sure what you mean by that," she said gently, "but I'm glad you made it home safely. Now let me bring you your breakfast before the lunch rush starts." The man nodded slightly and watched her walk back toward the kitchen, his expression thoughtful. Emily pushed the swinging door open and stepped inside the warm kitchen where Carl stood flipping pancakes on a grill. "Order up," she said, placing the ticket beside the register. "House breakfast and coffee." Carl glanced at the order and then at Emily. "Window table again. That guy looks like he came from one of those fancy offices downtown. You sure he knows where he is?" Emily shrugged lightly. "Everyone needs breakfast somewhere." Carl laughed quietly and slid eggs onto a plate. "True enough." A few minutes later, Emily returned to the table, carrying the plate of eggs, toast, and hash browns along with a steaming mug of coffee. She placed everything neatly in front of the man. Here you go. Let me know if you need anything else. Thank you, he replied calmly. Emily began to step away again when he spoke once more. Would you mind sitting for just a moment? Emily hesitated. Waitresses rarely sat with customers, especially during the busy hours, but the lunch rush had not fully arrived yet. She glanced around the room, then pulled out the chair across from him. Only for a minute, she said with a small smile. I still have work to do. That is fair, the man answered. He took a sip of coffee and studied her for a moment. Emily Carter, he said quietly, why did you help me last night? The question caught her off guard. She looked down at her hands, resting on the table, and thought about it for a second. Because you asked for help, she replied simply. The man leaned forward slightly. Many people ask for help in this city. Most people walk away. Emily gave a soft shrug. Maybe they have their reasons. Life can be difficult for everyone. The man nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. And what about you, Emily? Is life difficult for you? She laughed lightly, not in bitterness, but with a calm honesty that surprised him. I think life is difficult for a lot of people right now. But I have a job, a place to live, and 2 working hands. That is more than some people have. The man watched her quietly. She spoke without self-pity, without trying to impress him. There was a quiet strength in her voice that felt rare in the world he came from. He took another sip of coffee and finally spoke again. Emily, my name is Daniel. Daniel Whitaker. She nodded politely. Nice to meet you, Daniel. But the name meant nothing to her. Daniel noticed the lack of recognition immediately, and a faint smile crossed his face. That confirmed something important. She truly had no idea who he was. Tell me something, he continued gently. If someone offered you an opportunity to change your life, would you take it? Emily frowned slightly at the strange question. That depends on what kind of opportunity you mean. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The kind that rewards people who believe kindness still matters. Emily studied him for a moment, unsure whether he was joking or speaking seriously. Finally, she gave a small amused smile. Well, Daniel, if that opportunity involves finishing your breakfast before it gets cold, I fully support it. Daniel laughed quietly for the first time since he had entered the diner. I will keep that in mind. Emily stood up and picked up the empty coffee pot. I should get back to work now, but if you need anything else, just wave. Daniel nodded and watched her walk away again, moving gracefully between tables as she served customers with quiet patience. For several minutes, he remained seated in silence, thinking. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket and removed a sleek business card, placing it carefully on the edge of the table. When Emily returned a few minutes later to refill his coffee, Daniel slid the card toward her. Emily glanced down at it, then looked back up at him in confusion. What is this? Daniel met her eyes calmly. Something that might answer the question you asked a moment ago, about what opportunity looks like. Emily looked down at the card resting on the table and picked it up carefully between her fingers. The card was thick and smooth, far more expensive than the simple paper business card she had seen before. Black lettering stood cleanly against a white background. She read the words silently at first, and then her eyes moved across the line again as if her mind needed a second moment to understand what it said. Daniel Whitaker, founder and chief executive officer. Whitaker Global Holdings. For several seconds, Emily simply stared at the card. The busy sounds of the diner faded into the background as her mind struggled to connect the quiet man sitting in front of her with the powerful name printed on the card. She slowly lifted her eyes and looked at him again, searching his face for any hint that this might be a joke. Daniel watched her calmly, the same thoughtful expression resting in his eyes. Emily shook her head slightly and gave a small, uncertain laugh. This cannot be real, she said softly. Daniel did not react with offense or pride. Instead, he spoke with quiet patience. It is real, Emily. The company name might not mean much to you, but it is the truth. Emily looked down at the card again. Even if she did not follow business news closely, the name Whitaker Global sounded familiar. She remembered hearing it once on the television above the diner counter during a financial news segment. Slowly, the realization settled in. She was standing in front of one of the most powerful business leaders in the country. Her first reaction was not excitement. It was confusion. Why are you here? She asked honestly. Why would someone like you come back to a small diner just to talk to a waitress? Daniel folded his hands calmly on the table. Because a waitress at a train station showed more kindness than most people I meet in boardrooms filled with executives. Emily frowned slightly. It was only $10. It was everything you had, Daniel replied quietly. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but then stopped. There was no reason to deny the truth. Daniel continued speaking before the moment became uncomfortable. In my world, Emily, generosity often comes with expectations. Donations, sponsorships, public announcements. What you did last night had none of that. You helped a stranger because you believed it was the right thing to do. Emily looked away for a moment, embarrassed by the attention. I just did what anyone should do. Daniel shook his head gently. That is where you were wrong. Not everyone would have done that. He leaned slightly forward and lowered his voice. Which is why I want to offer you something. Emily looked back at him cautiously. Offer me what? Daniel paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. An opportunity. A real one. My company operates several community programs that support people who are struggling financially. Housing assistance, job training, educational grants. Programs designed to help people rebuild their lives. Emily listened quietly, still unsure where the conversation was leading. Daniel continued. I believe those programs should be guided by people who understand hardship, not just executives sitting in offices. People like you. Emily blinked in surprise. People like me. Yes. Daniel nodded once. I would like you to come work with us. Emily stared at him in disbelief. Daniel, I wait tables for a living. I do not have a business degree or experience in corporate work. Daniel smiled slightly. What you have is something far more valuable. Compassion and the courage to act on it. Emily felt her heart begin to beat faster as the weight of his words settled in. The diner around them suddenly felt smaller, as if the world outside its windows had quietly expanded. I do not even know what to say, she admitted. Daniel slid the business card closer to her again. Say you will think about it. That is all I ask. Emily held the card in her hand again and looked down at the bold letters printed across it. For the first time in many months, she felt something unfamiliar rising quietly in her chest. Possibility. Daniel finished the last sip of his coffee and stood up from the table. I will not pressure you, he said calmly. But sometimes life gives us one unexpected moment that changes everything. He placed a few bills on the table to pay for the meal and turned toward the door. Emily remained standing beside the table, still holding the card as she watched him walk away. The bell above the door rang softly as he stepped outside into the afternoon light. And for the first time since the difficult months of struggle had begun, Emily Carter realized that the small act of kindness she had given away on a rainy train platform might truly be the beginning of a completely different future. For the rest of the afternoon, Emily Carter moved through the diner as if the world had tilted slightly beneath her feet. She carried plates, refilled coffee cups, and greeted customers with the same polite smile she always wore, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the white business card resting inside the pocket of her apron. Daniel Whitaker, founder and chief executive officer. The words felt unreal every time she repeated them in her mind. Several times she reached in her pocket just to feel the card there, as if she needed proof that the conversation had truly happened. Carl noticed her distraction almost immediately. During a quiet moment near the counter, he leaned toward her with a curious look. The guy who left earlier seemed important, he said. The way he carried himself did not look like someone who eats in places like this. Emily hesitated before answering. His name is Daniel Whitaker. Carl blinked twice and stared at her. Wait, the Daniel Whitaker, the one who owns half the buildings downtown. Emily nodded slowly. That is what the card says. Carl let out a low whistle and shook his head in disbelief. And he just came in here for breakfast. That makes absolutely no sense. Emily gave a quiet smile, but said nothing more. She was still trying to understand it herself. The afternoon rush eventually faded into the quieter hours of early evening. One by one, the customers left until only a few people remained sitting near the window. Emily wiped down the last table and untied her apron as Carl counted the register behind the counter. You heading home? He asked. Emily nodded. Yes. It has been a long day. Carl glanced toward the door and then back at her. That business card in your pocket might mean something big, you know? Just be careful. People with that kind of power do not usually notice ordinary folks like us unless there is a reason. Emily understood his concern, but something inside her felt different from fear. Daniel Whitaker had not looked at her like a powerful man studying a stranger. He had looked at her with genuine respect. "I will be careful," she said softly. After saying goodbye, she stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky had begun turning shades of orange and deep blue as the sun disappeared behind the buildings. Emily started the familiar walk back toward her apartment, her footsteps steady on the sidewalk. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the business card again, turning it over in her fingers as she walked. The streetlights flickered on one by one as twilight settled across the neighborhood. Part of her wanted to forget the entire conversation and return to the simple rhythm of her life. Wait tables, pay rent, survive 1 week at a time. But another part of her could not ignore the possibility that Daniel had placed in front of her. An opportunity. When she reached her apartment, building the hallway lights buzzed softly, as usual. She climbed the stairs slowly and unlocked the door to her small room. The quiet space greeted her the same way it always did, simple and familiar. Emily set her bag on the table and sat down in the chair near the window. For a long moment, she stared at the business card again. Finally, she took a deep breath and picked up her old phone from the table. The screen glowed softly as she searched for the name Daniel Whitaker. Within seconds, the results appeared. News articles, interviews, photographs of the same man standing beside government leaders and speaking at major conferences. The wealth and influence surrounding his name felt almost impossible to comprehend. Emily leaned back in her chair, stunned by what she was seeing. The stranger she had helped at the train station was not just successful. He was one of the most powerful business leaders in the country. Yet he had come back to a small diner just to find her. She looked down at the business card once more, her heart beating slightly faster. Outside the window, the city moved through its usual evening rhythm, unaware that inside a tiny apartment, a young woman was facing a decision that could change the direction of her entire life. Emily Carter slowly placed the card on the table in front of her and whispered the words Daniel had spoken earlier that day. Sometimes life gives us one unexpected moment that changes everything. And for the first time, she began to believe that moment might truly be real. That night, Emily Carter barely slept. The small clock beside her bed ticked steadily through the quiet hours while the glow from the streetlight outside painted pale lines across the ceiling. Each time she closed her eyes, the same thought returned. Daniel Whitaker had offered her an opportunity that people spent entire lifetimes hoping to receive. Yet the more she thought about it, the more uncertain she became. Early the next morning, she sat at the small table by the window with a cup of water and the business card placed directly in front of her. Outside, the sky was slowly brightening as the city began another day. Workers hurried along the sidewalks with briefcases and coffee cups while buses rumbled past the corner. Emily watched the movement below and tried to calm the storm of questions running through her mind. What if the job required skills she did not have? What if she failed and embarrassed herself in front of people who lived in a completely different world? And what if accepting Daniel's offer meant leaving behind the small life she had fought so hard to hold together? The diner, the neighborhood, the simple routine that had kept her grounded through difficult months. For nearly an hour, she sat there thinking. Finally, she reached for the card and turned it over again. On the back was a single handwritten note in Daniel calm handwriting. Call this number if you decide you are ready to talk. Emily stared at the number for a long moment. Then she slowly picked up her phone. Her hand hesitated above the screen as doubt whispered one last warning. But something stronger pushed her forward. Curiosity. Hope. She dialed the number before she could change her mind. The phone rang only once before a calm, professional voice answered. Whitaker Global Holdings Executive Office. This is Laura Mitchell speaking. Emily took a steady breath. Hello. My name is Emily Carter. I believe Mr. Daniel Whitaker asked me to call. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by a subtle shift in tone. Yes, Miss Carter. Mr. Whitaker mentioned that you might contact us. He asked that we arrange a meeting if you decided to reach out. Emily felt her heart beat faster. A meeting sounded far more serious than the simple conversation she had imagined. When would that be? Laura responded immediately. Mr. Whitaker is available this afternoon at 3 o'clock, if that works for you. Emily glanced at the small clock on the wall. That was only a few hours away. She swallowed quietly before answering. Yes, that works. Laura continued speaking with the same calm efficiency. Our headquarters building is located on Madison Avenue. Please check in at the front desk when you arrive. Someone will escort you upstairs. Thank you, Miss Carter. We look forward to meeting you. The call ended, leaving Emily sitting silently at the table with the phone still in her hand. For a moment, she simply stared at the wall as the reality of what she had just agreed to slowly settled in. She was about to walk into the headquarters of one of the largest corporations in the country, and she had nothing to wear except the simple clothes hanging in her closet. A nervous laugh escaped her lips. Well, she said quietly to herself, there is no turning back now. A few hours later, Emily stood on the sidewalk in front of a towering glass building that stretched high into the bright afternoon sky. The name Whitaker Global Holdings gleamed across the entrance in polished silver letters. Business professionals moved quickly through the revolving doors while sleek cars pulled up along the curb. Emily adjusted the sleeves of her cleanest blouse and took a steady breath. Compared to the elegant suits surrounding her, she felt painfully ordinary. But she remembered Daniel's words from the diner. Compassion, courage. Sometimes the most valuable qualities did not come from business schools or corporate offices. They came from real life. Emily lifted her chin slightly and stepped forward toward the entrance. Inside, the lobby, the floor shone like glass beneath the tall lights above. A receptionist looked up from the desk and offered a professional smile. Good afternoon. How may I help you? Emily walked to the counter and spoke clearly despite the nervous flutter in her chest. My name is Emily Carter. I have an appointment with Mr. Daniel Whitaker. The receptionist typed quickly into her computer before nodding. Yes, Miss Carter. Mr. Whitaker is expecting you. Please take the elevator to the top floor. Someone will meet you there. Emily thanked her and stepped into the elevator as the doors slid closed with a quiet sound. As the elevator began rising toward the upper floors, she looked at her reflection in the polished metal wall. The same woman who had stood on a rainy train platform only. Days earlier was now rising toward a meeting that could change her future. And somewhere above her, Daniel Whitaker was waiting to see what decision she would make. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Emily Carter stepped into a quiet hallway that felt worlds away from the noisy streets below. The floor beneath her shoes was polished stone, and the tall windows at the end of the corridor revealed a sweeping view of the city skyline stretching for miles in every direction. For a moment, she simply stood there, taking in the unfamiliar environment. The building felt calm and controlled, every detail designed with quiet precision. A woman in a dark blue business suit approached her with a professional smile. Miss Carter, she said politely, I am Laura Mitchell. We spoke on the phone earlier. Emily nodded, recognizing the voice immediately. Yes, thank you for meeting me. Laura gestured toward a set of glass doors at the end of the hallway. Mr. Whitaker is finishing a meeting right now, but he asked me to bring you inside. Emily followed her through the doors into a spacious waiting area where soft chairs faced a wide window overlooking Madison Avenue far below. The city traffic looked like tiny moving lines from this height. Emily sat down carefully, folding her hands in her lap as she waited. Her heart beat steadily as she tried to steady her thoughts. Everything here felt larger than anything she had ever experienced before. After a few minutes, the door to the conference room opened and several executives stepped out, speaking quietly among themselves as they walked past. Daniel Whitaker appeared last. The moment he saw Emily sitting near the window, his expression softened into the same calm smile she remembered from the diner. Emily stood quickly as he approached. I hope the elevator ride was not too intimidating, Daniel said warmly. Emily laughed nervously. I think I spent the entire ride wondering if I had stepped into the wrong building. Daniel shook his head gently. No, You're exactly where you're supposed to be. He gestured toward his office nearby. Come with me. They walked into a large corner office filled with natural light. The wide windows stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing a breathtaking view of the skyline and the river in the distance. Yet despite the scale of the room, the space felt simple and organized rather than flashy. Daniel motioned for Emily to sit across from his desk. Would you like some water or coffee? He asked. Water would be nice, Emily replied quietly. Daniel poured a glass from a small pitcher and handed it to her before taking his seat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily took a small sip of water while Daniel studied her with thoughtful curiosity. I am glad you decided to come today, he said finally. Emily placed the glass down gently. I almost did not. Everything about this situation feels very strange. Daniel nodded in understanding. That is a fair reaction. A few days ago, we were strangers standing on a train platform. Now we're sitting in a corporate office discussing your future. Emily smiled faintly. When you say it like that, it sounds even stranger. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk. Emily, I want to explain something clearly before we talk about anything else. I did not come back to the diner because I felt sorry for you. I came back because I was impressed by you. Emily looked surprised. Impressed by what? Daniel answered without hesitation. Your character. You helped someone you believed was in trouble without expecting anything in return. In my experience, that kind of integrity is rare. Emily listened quietly as he continued speaking. Whitaker Global operates several community outreach programs designed to support people facing financial hardship. We fund shelters, job training centers, and housing assistance across multiple cities. But programs like these only work when the people guiding them understand what struggle actually feels like. Daniel paused and met her eyes directly. That is why I asked you here today. Emily felt the weight of his words settle in the room between them. You really believe someone like me could help with something that big? She asked softly. Daniel smiled. I do not believe someone like you could help. I believe someone like you is exactly who these programs need. Emily sat silently for a moment, absorbing everything he had said. Outside the window, the afternoon sun reflected off the buildings of the city below, casting bright light across the office. Finally, she spoke again. And if I say yes, what happens next? Daniel leaned back in his chair with calm confidence. If you say yes, Emily Carter, your life is about to become very different from the one you walked into that diner with only a few days ago. Emily Carter sat quietly in the chair across from Daniel Whitaker as the sunlight streamed through the tall windows of his office. The city stretched beneath them like a living map of steel and glass. But Emily's attention remained fixed on the calm man sitting behind the desk. His words still echoed in her mind. Your life is about to become very different. For a moment, she wondered if she had somehow stepped into someone else's story. Only a few days earlier, she had been standing on a cold train platform with nothing but $10 in her pocket and a long night ahead. Now she was sitting inside one of the most powerful corporate offices in the country, being offered an opportunity she had never imagined. Emily finally broke the silence. I do not want to disappoint you, she said honestly. I have never worked in an office like this. I do not know anything about corporate programs or managing large organizations. Daniel listened carefully and then gave a calm, reassuring nod. That is exactly why you are valuable, Emily. People who grow up inside boardrooms often forget what the real world looks like. They make decisions based on numbers and reports instead of human experience. Emily considered his words, but still looked uncertain. I understand what you are saying, she replied slowly, but people in your company have degrees and years of experience. I have been carrying plates in a diner for the past 3 years. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the desk. Experience can be taught. Character cannot. The room fell quiet again as Emily absorbed that statement. Daniel continued speaking in a calm, steady voice. I am not offering you a position as an executive. I am offering you a chance to work directly with our community outreach division. The role would involve visiting our support centers, speaking with people who need help, and helping us design programs that actually work for them. Emily felt something shift inside her chest as he explained. That sounded less like a corporate job and more like a mission. But doubts still lingered. Why me? She asked softly. There must be thousands of people who could do that work better than I could. Daniel stood up from his chair and walked slowly toward the window behind his desk. He looked out across the city for a moment before answering. Why build my company? He said quietly. I believe success meant expanding numbers and influence. Every year, the company grew larger. Every year, the profits increased. But somewhere along the way, I began to realize something important was missing. He turned back toward her. Real connection. People inside corporations talk about helping communities, but most of them have never experienced the kind of struggle those communities face. Emily listened closely, sensing that Daniel's words carried more personal weight than business strategy. A few days ago, he continued, I stood on a train platform pretending to be a man who had lost everything. I wanted to see how the world would treat someone in that situation. Most people walked past without even looking at me. Some avoided eye contact completely. And then there was you. Emily lowered her eyes slightly, remembering the moment clearly. You did not hesitate. You gave away the last money you had to help someone you believed was in trouble. That decision told me more about your character than any resume ever could. Emily felt warmth rise to her cheeks. I did not know you were testing people, she admitted. Daniel smiled gently. That is the point. Kindness only means something when it is genuine. He returned to his desk and placed a folder in front of her. Inside were documents describing the community outreach programs his company funded across several cities. Shelters for families, job training centers, scholarship funds for students who could not afford college. Emily slowly turned the pages, amazed by the scale of what she was seeing. Daniel's voice remained calm as he spoke again. If you accept this position, Emily Carter, you will help us shape programs that change lives. Not because you study them in textbooks, but because you understand what it means to struggle and still choose kindness. Emily looked up from the folder, her heart beating steadily now. The fear she had felt earlier was slowly giving way to something stronger. Purpose. She took a deep breath and met Daniel's gaze across the desk. Then I think I understand what you are offering, she said quietly. And I think I am ready to hear what comes next. Emily Carter sat quietly for a moment after speaking. Those words, the folder still open in front of her on Daniel Whitaker's desk. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast soft reflections across the pages describing shelters, training programs, and community centers funded by his company. Just reading the descriptions made her realize how many lives these programs were touching every day. She slowly closed the folder and looked up at Daniel again. The uncertainty she had felt earlier was still present, but now it was mixed with something stronger. Determination. If I say yes to this, she said carefully, I want to do it the right way. I do not want to be someone who just sits in an office making decisions about people I do not understand. Daniel nodded immediately. That is exactly why I asked you to come here. He reached for another document on the desk and slid it toward her. This outlines the position I had in mind. It is not a traditional corporate role. You would spend most of your time visiting our community centers, speaking directly with the people who rely on these programs. You would listen to their stories and help our team understand what they actually need. Emily read the first page slowly. The position title was Community Impact Coordinator. The description emphasized field visits, interviews with families receiving support, and working with program managers to improve services. This does not look like a job meant for someone in a suit sitting behind a desk all day, she said with a small smile. Daniel returned the smile. Exactly. I'm not looking for someone who can recite policy reports. I'm looking for someone who remembers what it feels like to struggle and still believe that kindness matters. Emily looked back at the page and then up at him again. And you really trust me to help guide something this important? Daniel answered without hesitation. Yes. Because trust is built on character, not on titles. Emily sat quietly for a moment, thinking about the path that had led her to this office. The cold train platform, the $10, the diner. None of it had seemed extraordinary at the time. Yet somehow those small moments had opened the door to this opportunity. She closed the folder gently and placed both hands on the desk. Then I would like to accept the position, she said. Daniel's expression warmed immediately. I am glad to hear that. But Emily raised one finger slightly before he could continue. On one condition. Daniel leaned back with mild curiosity. I am listening. Emily took a steady breath. I want to keep learning. If I'm going to help with programs like these, I need to understand how they work. I do not want people to think I was given this role simply because I met you at the right moment. Daniel considered her request for a moment before nodding approvingly. That is a very reasonable condition. We can arrange training sessions with our outreach team so you can learn every part of the program. Emily felt relief wash through her chest. Thank you. Daniel stood from his chair and walked around the desk, extending his hand. Then welcome to Whitaker Global Community Outreach Division, Emily Carter. She stood and shook his hand, her grip firm despite the nerves still fluttering in her stomach. For a brief moment, she looked around the office again, realizing that her life had just taken a completely unexpected turn. Daniel released her hand and spoke again with quiet sincerity. There's one more thing I want you to know before you begin this work. Emily looked at him curiously. What is that? Daniel reached into his wallet and carefully removed the same worn $10 bill from the train station. He held it up between his fingers with a small, thoughtful smile. This bill stays with me as a reminder. Emily tilted her head slightly. A reminder of what? Daniel answered softly. That real leadership does not begin in boardrooms or corporate towers. It begins in moments of kindness when no one is watching. Emily felt a quiet warmth rise in her chest as she looked at the small piece of paper. The $10 that had once been the last money she owned had now become a symbol of something much larger. And for the first time, she realized that the act of kindness she had offered a stranger on a rainy night had not only changed her own future. It had also changed the way a powerful man chose to see the world. The following weeks moved forward with a rhythm that felt both overwhelming and strangely exhilarating for Emily Carter. Each morning, she rode the elevator to the upper floors of Whitaker Global Holdings, still slightly amazed that the glass building on Madison Avenue had become part of her daily life. Yet Daniel Whitaker had kept his promise. Emily did not spend her days sitting behind a desk studying reports. Instead, she traveled across the city with members of the community outreach team, visiting shelters, training centers, and housing support offices funded by the company. On her very first visit, she stepped inside a small community center located in an older neighborhood on the south side of the city. The building itself was modest, with worn wooden floors and faded paint on the walls, but the energy inside the room felt warm and alive. Volunteers were helping people complete job applications, while others offered guidance about affordable housing programs. A young man in work boots was learning how to write a resume, while a middle-aged woman spoke with a counselor about finding stable employment after losing her previous job. Emily moved quietly through the room, introducing herself and listening to each story with careful attention. Many of the people she met reminded her of the months she had spent struggling to pay rent and keep food in her refrigerator. They spoke about long nights worrying about bills, about the embarrassment of asking for help, and about the hope that one opportunity could change everything. Instead of feeling distant from these stories, Emily understood them deeply. That understanding became her greatest strength. When the outreach team returned to the office later that afternoon, Emily sat with the program managers and shared what she had observed. She spoke honestly about the challenges people faced when applying for assistance and suggested small improvements that could make the process easier for families already under stress. To her surprise, the experienced managers listened carefully and began discussing how to implement several of her ideas. Word of her insight quickly spread through the outreach department. Within a few weeks, Emily was traveling regularly between different centers across the city and neighboring communities, gathering feedback and helping the team adjust programs based on real experiences from the people they served. Daniel followed her progress quietly from a distance, often reading the reports she helped prepare. One afternoon, he invited her back to his office to discuss the impact she was already having. Emily arrived carrying a notebook filled with observations from the centers she had visited that week. Daniel greeted her with the same calm smile he had shown since the day they met. "It seems you have been very busy," he said as she sat down. Emily nodded with quiet enthusiasm. There are so many people who want to rebuild their lives if someone simply gives them a fair chance. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his hands thoughtfully. That is exactly what these programs were designed to do, but until recently we were missing something important. Emily looked at him curiously. What was missing? Daniel answered with quiet sincerity, a voice that truly understood the people we were trying to help. He opened a folder on his desk and turned it toward her. Inside were photographs taken at several community centers showing people participating in training sessions and counseling programs. In one picture, a group of volunteers stood beside a newly opened job resource room funded by Whitaker Global. Emily recognized several faces she had spoken with during her visits. Daniel pointed to the images. Since he began working with the outreach team, participation in these programs has increased significantly. People trust someone who listens to them. Emily felt a mixture of pride and humility as she studied the photographs. She had never imagined that her small role could influence something so meaningful. Daniel closed the folder and looked at her again. Emily Carter, he said calmly, do you remember what you told me in the diner the first day we spoke? She thought for a moment before answering. I said that sometimes people just need help getting home. Daniel smiled warmly. Exactly. And what you're doing now is helping thousands of people find their way home again. Emily looked out the tall window behind his desk as the evening sunlight spread across the city skyline. The journey that began with $10 on a rainy train platform had grown into something far greater than she could have imagined. And for the first time in her life, she felt certain that her kindness had not only opened a door for her, it had created a path that could change the lives of many others. 1 year passed quietly after the day Emily Carter walked into the glass tower of Whitaker Global Holdings for the first time. The city had moved through every season since that moment, and back again to the warm promise of spring. Yet for Emily, the passing months had not simply been a change in weather. They had been a transformation of purpose. The community outreach programs she helped guide continued to grow stronger with every passing month. New job training centers opened in neighborhoods that once struggled with unemployment. Housing assistance programs expanded to support families who had been living on the edge of losing everything. Emily traveled constantly between these centers, speaking with people, listening to their experiences, and helping the outreach teams adapt their programs to meet real needs. Many of the people she met reminded her of the person she had been before that rainy night at the train station. Someone trying to stay strong, even when life felt uncertain. That understanding made every conversation genuine. Word of the program's success began to spread across the city. Local news stations featured stories about families finding stable work through the training programs. Community leaders praised the practical changes that had made assistance easier to access. Yet whenever reporters asked Daniel Whitaker about the reason behind the improvement, he always gave the same answer. True progress begins when someone listens with compassion. One quiet evening near the end of the spring season, Daniel invited Emily to visit a newly completed community center located not far from the same train station where they had first met. The building stood proudly on the corner of a street that had once been lined with empty storefronts. Now the center offered classrooms for job training, counseling offices for families in need, and a resource library for people searching for new opportunities. As Emily stepped inside the bright, welcoming space, she felt a quiet wave of emotion rise in her chest. The walls were filled with photographs showing people who had rebuilt their lives through the outreach programs. Daniel stood beside her near the entrance and watched as she took in the room. This place exists because someone believed kindness should never be ignored, he said gently. Emily smiled and looked around at the people moving through the center. Some were studying at tables. Others were speaking with counselors about job opportunities. The room carried the quiet energy of hope. Daniel reached into his wallet and removed the same worn $10 bill he had kept since the night they met. He held it carefully between his fingers before placing it inside a small glass frame mounted near the entrance wall. Beneath the frame was a simple engraved message. One act of kindness can change 1,000 lives. Emily looked at the framed bill for a long moment. Remembering the cold platform and the uncertain stranger she had helped without expecting anything in return. "I never imagined that $10 could lead to all of this," she said softly. Daniel shook his head with a thoughtful smile. It was never about the money. It was about the choice behind it. The choice to care when no one else was watching. Emily looked around the center one more time, seeing people learning, rebuilding, and believing in new possibilities. The journey that began with a simple act of kindness had grown into something far larger than either of them had expected. And in that moment, Emily Carter understood a truth that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Sometimes the smallest gesture of compassion is the first step toward changing the world.